This video is about your security and your money because it's about global security and foreign policy. I'll be speaking about one of the most notorious groups in the world, the Islamic State or ISIS, and the recent developments in Syria regarding that group. I'll be speaking with Hassan Hassan, who is a leading counterterrorism expert and editor-in-chief of the New Lines magazine. Hello, everyone. This is me, Rafid Jaboori, and we are here with Hassan Hassan, a leading expert on counterterrorism and specifically on the Islamic State, ISIS. Hello, Hassan, and thanks for being with me.
Hi, Rafid. Thank you. Thank you for hosting me.
We are speaking today, one day after ISIS admitted that it lost its fourth caliph, its fourth leader, in somewhat different circumstances. He was not killed by the US this time, Hassan.
It depends basically on what you believe, but the local forces have been helpful previously with helpful to the Americans of hunting the leaders of ISIS. This was not this latest one was not killed by the Americans, but it was I think more interesting than that. The fact that depending also who you believe, the fact that he was killed by either the Turks or HTS in Syria, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the other jihadi rival for in that region.
Other jihadists killed the leader of the biggest jihadist group.
Yeah,
so this is the interesting element, at least according to ISIS, because they accuse their rivals.
So yeah, just to kind of take a step back here. So ISIS, according to ISIS, the leader of their leader was killed not by Turkey, but by a rival jihadi organization, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, in northwestern Syria. That's the area basically where Hayat Tahrir al-Sham holds sway in northwestern Syria. And Hayat Tahrir al-Sham came out and said, no, we didn't kill him. It was probably Turkey, and Turkey is saying we killed him. So yes, it's kind of a murky situation. But if you ask me who I believe, I think the situation is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham did kill him and did help the Turkey. Looked like they did kill him. But it's embarrassing for Hayat Tahrir al-Sham to say and to acknowledge this. It's complicated for them to look like they're working with a NATO country against a rival jihadist organization.
So let me quickly provide some geographical context, at least, and we'll be calling Hayat Tahrir al-Sham HTS from now on, and it is the main jihadi rival. In Syria, different parties control different parts of the country. Eastern Syria is controlled by Kurdish forces supported by the US. Northwestern Syria is controlled mainly by Sunni Syrian rebels supported by Turkey, but another part also of the northeast is controlled by and ruled by the HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the main jihadi rival of ISIS in Syria. And then the rest of the country, the rest of Syria, is controlled by the government of the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, but with significant support from Russia and Iran and the Iranian-backed militias. So this country is divided. Different areas are are controlled and ruled by different parties. But now we are specifically interested in northwestern Syria, an area that has a lot of displaced Syrians who came from other parts of Syria. And it's, as I said, can be divided into two parts. One part is controlled by different groups, local groups. In like almost in every town, there is a group, and all are supported by the immediate presence of the Turkish army. And then the other part of northwestern Syria, there is no Turkish army, but there is the HTS. And that's where the action happened, we believe, because we have now two stories. One is provided by the Turkish President Erdogan, who said in late April that his forces killed Abu al-Hussein al-Qurayshi, the leader of ISIS, or the fourth leader, caliph of ISIS. And now we have ISIS admitting the killing of their leader and announcing a new leader. We'll be talking about this later, but admitted the killing. But they said that he was killed by the HTS, not Turkey. HTS killed him and then handed over the body in order to boost the chances of the Turkish president in the Turkish elections. So it's a bit, it's a bit complicated, but it's still worth looking at, because this is a war that the U.S. Is still, one way or another, is still involved in. The U.S. had to go behind enemy lines and kill the first two leaders of ISIS, right? And now we have this fourth leader. We'll be talking about the third leader who was killed somewhere else. But now back to this story about, after providing a very necessary context about Syria, back to this incident, we have the ISIS, the Islamic State, saying that HTS, the main rival jihadist, killed their leader. Is that good or bad?
It's good. I mean, the fact that
the jihadists are fighting each other.
Yeah, it is good for basically that jihadists are fighting each other, but also good that ISIS is exposed to not the the US. I mean, it wouldn't be surprising, for example, if the US tracked a leader and with the help of other forces and killed him. That has become the cliche, essentially. That's what has been happening over the past few years. But the fact that another jihadi organization killed him, there's a lot of intrigue there. For example, why? And I'm curious to know what you think, because we've been talking for years and years since the rise of ISIS and before, and it's always helpful to kind of get your sense of where things are heading. But why would, for example, ISIS say not Turkey, but a jihadist, but their rival has killed their leader? I don't see any motivation for doing that, but I see motivation for HTS to deny that they did that and say,
and they did deny it.
Yeah, and then as they did, exactly. So I see the logic of Hayat Tahrir Sham or HTS doing that, but I don't believe them. I think they did play a role. It could be an official statement versus what their counter-ISIS forces on the ground have been doing. We know for a fact that they've been working with Turkey for years, and with even with the US, probably indirectly, to track ISIS leaders and commanders and members. They've been arresting ISIS commanders and members for years, and they are obsessed with the Islamic State as much as the Islamic State is obsessed with them, because they see themselves as like one of them has to take over. They're competing over over territory, but also over the jihadist space. Obviously now Hayat Tahrir Sham is on the top. It's the bigger jihadist organization in Syria, but widely, obviously, we can talk about regionally and internationally.
Because they control territory. Because they rule a big part of the Idlib province in northwestern Syria. Before I tell you what I think about the counterclaims, let me just explain why I asked you if this was good or bad, that jihadists were killing each other. Because in countries like Iraq and Syria, it wasn't always good news when bad guys were killing each other for the US. For example, in Iraq in 2006, when radical Sunnis and radical Shias were fighting each other, they were also killing the US. And the deterioration in the security situation meant also heavier casualties for the US troops in Iraq. And the story of Syria has been like that too, when we had increasingly more fightings between different and various Syrian armed groups after the Syrian revolution. The situation led to the rise of ISIS, and then the U.S. Had to go to war again in that region. It's not until the U.S. find a partner, a local partner, that becomes the real fighting force, with the U.S. Providing support. Unless that happens, the U.S. would not benefit. or did not benefit necessarily from the fighting between the various radical and fundamentalist groups. So that's why I asked you. And with regards to ISIS now claiming, I think the reason, the main, the main reason why ISIS leaders have been seeking refuge in that part of Syria, although it's ruled and controlled by groups that have bad blood with ISIS, is that actually the population, as I said, is mixed now. There is hundreds of thousands of displaced people. So there is a big, and it's the only area in Syria, the northwest is the only area in Syria where the population is majority Sunni Muslims, and it's not ruled by non-Sunnis. So if you see, for example, Eastern Syria, where the Americans are, it's Sunni population ruled by the Kurds, or at least the most powerful power are the Kurds, and the rest of the country you still have Iran, Assad government, and Russia. The population is ruled by non-Sunni powers. In the northwest, there is a bigger chance for someone to blend in and hide and disguise. So that's why there is a chance that ISIS leader, the very last one who was killed in April, Abu al-Hussein al-Qurayshi, was hiding like his predecessors, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the first ISIS caliph, and the second caliph Abu Ibrahim, was hiding in an HTS-controlled area. There is a chance that was the case, and Turkey would not go that deep without being very certain that it would not endanger its forces. I mean, Turkey, they have a very strong army, and they know the area well, and they have troops in the northwest, but they're not America. They can't do behind enemy lines operations with the same certainty and confidence, I would claim. So that's why I tend to believe that there is a role that the HTS had played in the killing of this caliph, whether by killing him and handed over the body to the Turks, as in the ISIS story, or by providing very exact information and intel to the Turks, and then the Turks launched the operation.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much there to unpack. For the last leader was killed not by a drone or a strike. No. It was killed by someone shooting them, and the one before that as well. So you had also, you remember the one in Daraa also, they said it was killed with the support of local rebels on the rebel forces on the ground in Syria.
Yeah.
All these are very, very interesting. Just means that ISIS doesn't have the same cover that they had before, the ability to kind of blend in and survive for years. Remember, Abu Bakr Baghdadi survived for a long time under hostile, in hostile circumstances, and things have changed. So yeah.
Let's do the chronological explanation of the ISIS leaders now. I think it's about time to do it. So the first caliph, the first leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who announced ISIS in 2014 as caliph, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, after the US-led coalition and the war that involved different parties, including Iran-backed militias, the Iraqi army, the Kurdish forces, the Syrian Kurdish forces, the Syrian Democratic Forces, supported by the US. Between 2014 and 2017, ISIS lost all the territory that it once controlled in Syria and Iraq. And then the whole organization went underground, including its leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, until he was killed in 2019 in a US raid, again behind enemy lines, in northwestern Syria. First, were you surprised to know that, because he was the first one that we learned that he was found and killed in that area of Syria where the control is for rival groups. Again, as I said, groups with bad blood with ISIS for many years. Were you surprised that he sought refuge in that part of Syria, not elsewhere in Iraq or Syria?
It was surprising, but I think it made sense after we kind of started to see details coming out of Iraq and from Syria, the route from from Anbar and Baghuz all the way to the Homs, the Badia of Syria. It has different names, but basically the desert area alongside the Iraqi-Syrian borders, and all the way to Haman, Homs, and north. That's an easy way for Baghdadi
escape route.
The escape route, exactly. So it wasn't. I mean, it was surprising. It was, but it wasn't kind of shocking in that sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's all these things are really interesting. It showed that we can talk more about what it means, because I think that's more interesting than the details. But just to kind of say before, kind of one caveat. I've been traveling in the region, visiting family and friends and others. And this time around, I probably had I didn't hear the same discussions that I had probably heard last year, the year before. Just ISIS doesn't register with people these days, as in it's not on their mind. It's not something people talk about as they did before. So I think in that sense, we have to kind of contextualize the presence of ISIS in Syria and elsewhere. That is a very minor organization, and probably it became clearer over the past year or two that ISIS in Iraq has been weakened so much. But at the same time, I think the reason why people talk about ISIS is that we don't want to forget the lessons before, that ISIS had disappeared and people didn't talk about it for years and years, and suddenly it came out to be stronger than before. And I think that is the bit I kind of maybe at some point in the discussion, if you like, we can kind of interrogate a little bit, because in the position I take is that as of now, I think people are more afraid of ISIS ghost than a real threat of ISIS, especially when it comes to that region, Iraq, Syria, and so on and so forth. I think they are really weakened. I don't think they are in a position to build, or they start strategically think of building and stuff like that. They are under pressure. They are on the defensive, and they are a very minor player. They're still troublemakers. Obviously, they can attack here and there. But it's not a major fear for people on the ground. It's still, but people are. But the biggest question, and this is a serious point to kind of discuss, is that is it building on under the ashes? Something is going to come in the future. What's the future for this? What it means that ISIS leaders have been killed more rapidly over the past, like I said, over the past 18 months or 4 years than they had ever done before. They had from the inception of ISIS until 2019, they had about 3 leaders, right, or 4.
3. I
And
would
then
say Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi in Iraq, who founded Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which became the Islamic State in Iraq, and then Abu Umar al-Baghdadi, and then Abu Bakr. Abu Mus'ab was killed in 2006. Abu Umar was killed in 2010, and Baghdadi took over. And
I'm counting a brief moment when Abu Ali al-Bari became the leader of that formation after Al-Qaeda. For a brief moment. So 3 leaders, essentially, for what we know today about ISIS, for the best part of its history.
Yeah.
And over the past few years, they've had about 4 leaders as well.
Yeah.
So that tells you that they're not the same as before, or at least that's an indication something is happening today. The safest area they deem to be an area that could be relocating their leaders to, which is northwestern Syria. It's definitely safer than the rest of Syria, probably easier for them probably to navigate. Definitely safer than Iraq. It has become safer than Iraq, but even that safe area, and that tells you everything, has become a hostile environment for them.
Yeah. Let me quickly mention that after Baghdadi was killed in 2019, the second caliph, because Baghdadi was the third leader, but the first caliph, the first one who claimed to be the caliph, the leader of, after reviving their self-professed revival of the Islamic State, the caliph. So after Baghdadi was killed in 2019, in February 2022, President Biden announced the killing after President Trump announced the killing of Baghdadi, and then in 2022 in February, Biden announced the killing of the second caliph Abu Ibrahim al-Hashimi, again in northwestern Syria, in an operation behind enemy lines by the U.S. And the third caliph was the exception because, as you mentioned, he was killed in Dar'a in southern Syria during some fightings with other Syrian opposition groups. So that was a kind of accidental death. That's the exception. And then the fourth caliph, the guy that we have been talking about, and we started this talk discussing his killing. And now the new leader is called Abu Hafs al-Qurashi. Again, another obscure figure, someone we don't know about. Just like the previous two that were, they have come and gone without actually knowing who they were exactly. Now we have this third. But it's still amazing. It's still amazing that under the circumstances, with that decline, with the massive pressure from everywhere on ISIS in its heartland in Syria and Iraq, it still managed to survive, but also managed to secure and maintain the allegiance of jihadist groups around the world, like in Africa and in Southeast Asia. So it's not dead yet, ISIS.
It's not, and that is exactly the part. I remember at some point I said one of the probably the biggest failures for the U.S.-led coalition against ISIS was that by the time ISIS lost its caliphate, the branches of ISIS around the world or around the region didn't really break away from ISIS, and that tells you a few things we could talk about. I think early on, I think from 2015, I was talking at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and I was saying that the thing about ISIS members is once someone starts thinking of joining ISIS, as in like someone has been convinced and persuaded by this ideology, it's almost too late to reverse that process of radicalization. It's something about ISIS, even distinctive from Al-Qaeda, that makes their members so loyal to the organization, and
they become real converts. With all exactly. The meaning in that word.
Exactly. And I think it's because it's more cultish than other jihadist organizations. It operates in that. And people who have believed in this organization, even if they haven't fought for the organization, continue to believe in it until today. From reports on the ground and from people we can kind of report on in Syria and Iraq and elsewhere, even in camps. People say like with Al-Qaeda, Rafid, you can talk about so many members who said they no longer believe in Al-Qaeda, or they clash with Al-Qaeda. I mean, ISIS is a prime example of that. But we haven't seen the same with ISIS. We've seen some other people, like because of the infighting initially. I think that was exaggerated in terms of the numbers. Turns out there are few, and they were really it's a personal clashes within ISIS. It wasn't really much ideological. There were differences about what Baghdadi did and could have done, and that was natural. But I don't think we didn't see the kind of major defections. I think the reason why we saw early on after the demise of ISIS signs of some cells within ISIS kind of defecting or speaking out against Baghdadi, I think the reason for that was it was more like groupings, like people who were tied together, like a bunch of, for example, Jordanian jihadists who wanted to form something else, and so on and so forth. But they still really more or less kind of in the orbit of ISIS. And none of, like I said, none of the branches across the world from Sinai, from West Africa, from the Sahel basically to Sinai to Afghanistan, defected from ISIS, and that tells you a lot about the cohesion within the organization. So that, yes, I think that's a plus for ISIS, that the fact that they haven't really defected. But how much of ISIS is left from there, and what their chances are, it is still kind of a player globally, but I think it's much less than I don't know what it was before, for sure. Yeah.
And in this book of yours, the ISIS Inside the Army of Terror, that you co-authored with Michael West, and the first edition was in 2015, you explained some, the features of this distinct nature of ISIS. But we're still learning about that, even during this phase of the group. But I still have two areas to cover with you. One, about the reports about ISIS possible cooperation, or at least agreement, with the Shia forces, with Iran and allies. Over the years, we saw some amazing agreements between the two sides, but on kind of de-escalation more than cooperation. Now, there's different reports about attacking the U.S., agreeing not to attack each other, but attack the U.S. instead. And we will go back to Hayat Tahrir Sham, HTS, and its future, because it's still, as you said, it still controls territory. And the main element of our discussion about ISIS is that it no longer controls territory in Syria, but the HTS still does. So first, let's talk about Iran and the main Shia powerhouse in the Middle East and its allies. It has militias in Iraq and Syria, but recently there were reports on Syrian opposition platforms claiming that sometime 2 years ago, there was an agreement between Iran and ISIS in Syria that the Iranian militias, and even the Syrian forces of the government of Bashar al-Assad, would not attack ISIS in the vast Syrian desert, and in return of ISIS not attacking them but focusing on the US. Do you think that's possible?
So, agreements of this nature can have like different forms. Sometimes they're not agreements, but it's like if someone is in control, you sort of can manage the situation. And I think the Iranians and the Assad regime have proven to be very effective in kind of distributing the resources and kind of turning a blind eye to certain forces.
Yes.
Not in exchange, in direct kind of conversation with them, but in terms of steering them towards there. That's something we've, it's not a conspiracy theory. It's something we've come to see a lot of evidence to kind of support. And also, we know, even a Syrian official once admitted on TV, like he wasn't ashamed of saying that the Assad regime has infiltrated ISIS, and from within they can have voices that can support, steer the organization towards one or the other. But I don't think, generally speaking, I find it hard to believe the story that they have that agreement. Again, it could be done in a kind of indirectly or in different ways, like effectively an agreement, but it's not an agreement. A few years ago, ISIS had signs of kind of resurgence. I think it was 2020, especially with the pandemic. They started operating in Iraq. They could especially in rural areas, and then it weakened with time. And then I think a year ago there were signs of ISIS actually having convoys in the desert where they can stop people and so on and so forth. These activities that we saw back in the day in 2012 and 13. Where they stop people and behead people and so on and so forth. That kind of the year that, like the time before 2014, when they announced the caliphate and controlled much of Iraq and Syria.
Yes.
So I think the story, the simple answer is ISIS has been weakened. There is also intelligence reports from the US that the Iranians and the Assad regime did want everyone to turn on the Americans and kind of make it hard for the US to continue to operate in eastern Syria and eastern or northeastern Syria. So it is possible. I mean, it comes like the reports about the agreement at least align with the desire by the Iranians and the Assad regime to turn on the Americans and to turn the heat essentially on the Americans in eastern Syria. But I think that was probably like for a brief minute, and then I don't know what happened after that. But yeah, so I think we can talk more about like where they operate and who, whether ISIS is actually deciding not to attack the Assad regime or Iran, or they don't know how to, or so on and so forth.
Do you think the estimation that there is still about 15 to 17,000 ISIS fighters operating underground in Syria, specifically and in the desert, do you think that number is realistic?
No, I don't think so. I think they are in the thousands. The numbers are always, as you know, they're amplified, and it's like, it's easy. It's sexier to say ISIS has 17,000, fighters, and we have
just
to
10, then 10,000 or 20,000.
Yeah, exactly. To continue the fight against them. I always found the numbers to be exaggerated. You can, it's like any government stats. Sometimes they count certain things that really don't, they're not like the fighting force of ISIS or people who sympathize or estimate. Like, for example, this is how much we budget for this many people, right? And I think it's part of the budgeting sometimes, like, budgeting not in terms of money, but also like if we are fighting the organization and some people say it has 100,000 members and our estimate is 30,000, if there's a possibility that higher number is real, then I need to budget for that, right? So they will take these numbers rather than like the lower numbers, in my opinion.
Yeah. Let me tell you what's going to be what would be a game changer in terms of ISIS potential reemergence. If under any circumstances the US pulls out of Syria and or Iraq, that's going to be a game changer. If under any circumstances or for any reason Turkey decided to pull out from northwestern Syria and the rest and northern Syria, that also could be a game changer. So and these two changes are not imminent now. We had the outcome of the Turkish elections, for example. If President Erdogan was to be defeated in a couple of months ago, a new government in Turkey would have pulled out. But now that's not the case, and they're mostly staying. But if under the circumstances the Turks and more so the Americans, if they are to pull out from Syria and or Iraq, ISIS will have a very big shift of the environment and of the ground, and they might really see a chance to reemerge. But can the US stay forever?
Well, so far there's no urgency not to. So I think the US is staying. The Biden administration, as you know, initially people thought like they're going to leave, especially after they left Afghanistan.
Yeah, we're going to be
Syria
we'll come to this next.
Yeah, Syria was the next supposedly, but then Syria was next, but it didn't happen. I think they know exactly what you just said. Like they know that the commitment, the resources are minimal. You don't even tell, or you could it's not like easy to tell whether the US is present in Syria or not. Like, where are they, right? Like it's really they're just managing the Kurdish forces, and they're managing the airspace. That's really what they do. And obviously they support with the intelligence and coordinating with others, a lot of facilities. So the cost is minimal. But the cost of not doing that is maximal in that sense. So I don't see any administration. It's not even politically, like it's not a good slogan to say, oh, we're leaving from Syria. Trump tried it. He decided to leave. Everyone in DC at the time was saying, anyone who says Trump is not leaving, is crazy. I was at the time saying there's no way they're going to leave, and they, they stayed, but obviously downsized their presence
Yes.
in Syria. But like we can talk more about where what's the chances of ISIS. Also very important to kind of define, like ISIS will take advantage of any vacuum if the US leaves, but how much can they benefit from that, and are their forces, their enemies, are they able to fight back, and so on and so forth. This is like all endless questions, and also you have to kind of think also of the global jihadist scene and Islamist scene, not really jihadists, like people think of Al-Qaeda and ISIS.
Yes.
But there's so much has changed in the world. Like there's, the old products of Islamism and jihadism have changed, and the market has changed. So basically, what I mean, like basically, the world has changed in a lot of ways, and I think we are still, as counterterrorism experts in general, I'm kind of generalizing, we're still almost bogged down in like old paradigms. ISIS has lost the ground before and emerged after that, or lost and came back. The Muslim Brotherhood died and then came back, or kind of was
this could be a good topic for a future conversation with you.
But the context is, I think the context is kind of relevant in the sense that how much should we be scared of the re-emergence of ISIS? I think the context around ISIS is important, like with the landscape and the context. But yeah, I agree, it's a completely different topic.
Briefly, before my last question, what do you think of Turkey? Do you think the Turkish presence now, provided that they claim that they killed ISIS leader, is it how do you see it in terms of the fighting against the Islamic State and the fundamentalist Islamist groups in Syria?
So for Turkey, they have two enemies in Syria now, the Kurds and ISIS.
Yes.
ISIS is not an urgent, like direct enemy, obviously. It's a second one, but they know that they can't, because they have the sustainability of their forces, the forces they support on the ground, which is that kind of the Muslim Brotherhood type, the rebel nationalist, and the Turkey aligned, kind of Turkic ethnic groups in northern Syria. They're all in danger if ISIS emerges in their area. So Turkey has an interest in kind of making sure that ISIS is weakened, but it's not urgent on their list of urgent, like what's urgent. Obviously the Kurds are the urgent ones, so they will continue to fight, I think, and help in the fight against ISIS. Also, it's rewarding for them to say every now and then that they've killed an ISIS member. It's politically expedient for them to kind of say that, it's for the West, but also for internally in Turkey.
Oh yes, it boosts the relations with the US. But now, more interestingly, people are entertaining theories that actually not only the Turks, but the HTS, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which controls Idlib, are also trying to reverse the US designation for them and their leader with what they are doing. I know that they denied killing this ISIS leader, but they have been cooperating with the efforts to counter ISIS. And of course, they're kind of the model that they aspire to is the Taliban now, after the Taliban take over of Afghanistan. Do you think that they have a chance, the HTS in Syria?
So I think Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, is thinking along the lines of kind of a agreement, de facto agreement with the US rather than explicit. Neither side wants to be seen as allied with each other, right?
Yeah.
For HTS to say, we are now American friends, that will help their other jihadi rivals and so on and so forth. And for the US to say that this designated organization is now an American ally is also problematic. Yeah. So the best case scenario for each side is wink, wink, let's work together, maybe indirectly, like through like a wall, we can hear each other and so on and so forth from each side. And I think that's been happening. So there's a de facto delisting of Hayat Tahrir Sham by the US, in the sense of we're not really activating this list, meaning like we're not going after members of Hayat Tahrir Sham, killing them or blocking their things. Obviously, financially, they're not going to allow them to use financial transactions and stuff like that, but it's not on the priority list of the US. So in effect, that is similar to the situation between the Taliban and the US in many ways. So, you know what I mean? Like for now, it's working for both sides. Yeah. And there's no urgency for Hayat Hassan to, it's not like they control a country and the US needs to recognize them.
No, but they control province. They control a territory.
Yeah, and I think the US is helping. I'm not saying like not the US. They're not helping HTS, but they're helping calm down, freeze.
Yes,
the fighting in Syria, and
Trump famously said, if you remember, Trump famously said that he aborted a plan to attack the northwestern Syria when there was some kind of agreement between Turkey and Russia to do it. Yeah. So he said and that also, he was vehemently against it.
You like I said, the context is also like sometimes if we focus on the context, it helps us understand the pieces. So, for example, if you would think of Turkey now is flirting with the Assad regime. Erdogan is hinting that he could potentially meet Bashar al-Assad and so on and so forth. But you have to understand that the priority for Turkey is the Kurds, and their whole policy in Syria and the whole approach is anchored in that priority in Syria. That is not going to change, by the way. Like you said, for example, earlier, had Erdogan lost the election, maybe a subsequent alternative national ultra-nationalist government would withdraw from Syria. I think they wouldn't. Like no government in Turkey will withdraw from Syria, because they all agree on that fundamental Kurdish threat from Syria. And if you remember back in the 80s and 90s, the non-Muslim Islamists, like they were not even an Islamist government, not even close, in power, they still follow the same policy that Erdogan would later follow in Syria, which is to kind of be very aggressive, to kind of help even the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, try to help them against the Assad regime. The Kurds were a priority, and so on and so forth. So I think from that point of view, Turkey is staying in Syria. It's not going to leave Syria, and that means HTS is going to stay where it is, and therefore, from that we can understand that the war against ISIS will always continue from both sides. Where there's Turkey, there's the Turkish aligned forces, like directly supervised by the Turks, are going to fight ISIS, and Hayat Tahrir Sham, which is aligned with Turkey, but they're not really under the protection, under the supervision of Turkey. These are all forces against ISIS, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. So in that sense, the momentum in northwestern Syria is unfavorable to ISIS, and it's favorable to Hayat Tahrir Sham. And I think the future for that region is Hayat Tahrir Sham, not ISIS.
And we will be looking forward to speaking with you more in the future. So thank you so much, Hassan, for coming.
Thank you.
And we will see you again. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafid. Thanks.